Here is an eminently cool phrase that we in the business education community get to use often. It's jargon, yes, but it's jargon that all of us can utilize in a host of situations. The phrase, the strategic inflection point. Because the strategic inflection point is a concept that captures much of what surprises us in the world in the most profound of ways. The strategic inflection point is a term popular in business, but we apply to a wide range of phenomena. It was introduced by Andy Grove in 1996 in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. He, in turn, being trained as an engineer, got the concept from mathematics, where an inflection point refers to any place where a positive curve turns negative, or a negative curve turns positive. The strategic inflection point is a dramatic change in our environment that makes us alter the way we do things, or risk extinction. This isn't minor change that suggests we tweak our procedures. It is major change that demands we rethink everything. This shifting of tectonic plates gives us no choice. It requires us. It compels us to change our strategy. For Intel, a strategic inflection point came when low-cost memory chips from Japan forced Intel to abandon memory chips and focus its business on microprocessors instead. Strategy presents us with paradoxes. The strategic inflection point is no different. As with so many things in hindsight, the major changes that seem to alter the fundamentals of the way we do everything appear obvious. Looking backward, history takes only one course, the path actually chosen. We tend to think that history as it unfolded was, in some sense, inevitable. We forget the many alternatives that were available at the time. Competitive advantage is conferred on those companies and individual people who can do these two things well. Be the first to recognize a major change in the environment that affects their activities, and they must be the first to respond to that change correctly. So, to gain a competitive advantage, the recognition and the response must be ahead of competitors, and it must be correct. Now, the change doesn't have to be as monumental as an inflection point. It can be something that pushes what we consider best practices outward. Identifying changes in your overall environment in your specific industry goes back to the PEST scan and the 5 factors analysis we discussed 3 lectures ago. In those cases, the firm or army, sports team, or individual that first develops the best response to the changed environment may win a competitive advantage. It's temporary, of course. Best practices means that the knowledge diffuses quickly among practitioners, and the brief competitive advantage of one soon becomes the new competitive parity of all. This is guaranteed by what I like to call the cult of efficiency, driven by the fact that even companies without a real strategy typically want to be efficient. Now, strategic inflection points can occur in business, sports, politics, and in the profession of arms. It's something new, which cannot be ignored. Sometimes an inflection point affects several of these realms. Oftentimes we face our own strategic inflection point, and we have to rethink our strategic plans, perhaps even scrap them and start anew. In the business world, the strategic inflection point is usually manifested by technological advances or shifts in the competitive environment so severe that they change the rules of our competitive game. 2 examples we've already discussed are big box bookstores and electronic reading devices that threaten publishers and sellers of printed books and information. These changes can also be a sharp change in customer preferences, the introduction of a changed regulatory environment, or the dramatically enhanced value of certain raw materials. Despite the eventually monumental impact of a strategic inflection point, it may not be immediately apparent to everyone. In fact, Andy Grove says that the change hits the corporation in such a way that those in senior management usually recognize it last. The common element in all of these changes is that they require a fundamental change of strategy on the part of the firm, or the firm faces extinction. The film industry of the early 1930s provides both corporate and personal examples of how a strategic inflection point can alter the business landscape. The silent film era in Hollywood began in the early 1900s, and it lasted until 1927, which is considered the dawn of the talking film industry. Within a decade, silent film production had ceased. But what now seems the most natural progression in the world was not wholeheartedly welcomed in the mid-1920s. In fact, the revolution that sound film was about to make wasn't even recognized as such. Harry Warner of Warner Brothers famously remarked in 1927, "Who in the hell wants to hear actors talk?" A famous actor of the time, Ronald Colman, was dismissive, and he called the talking motion picture a temporary digression. Colman sniffed, "I am not sympathetic to this sound business. I feel, as many do, that this is a mechanical resource, that it is retrogressive. In short, that it does not properly belong to my particular work." Colman soon changed his mind, but fellow performer Charlie Chaplin had a much stronger sense of mission and a global brand to protect. He declared in 1930, "I shall never speak in a film. I am a mime, and all the nuances of my art would be destroyed if I were to accompany them with words or sound effects." He released the silent film City Lights in 1931 with great success, created a hybrid film in 1936 called Modern Times, where other actors spoke, but his own character only made some nonsense sounds. When Chaplin finally recognized the strategic inflection point in 1940, he did so brilliantly. He used his voice and other talents to mock Adolf Hitler in The Great Dictator, which became his most profitable film. This resistance to change is not unique to the revolution in motion pictures of the 1920s. It appears endemic to how most people view change and innovation. A more recent example in business is the tremendous inflection point sustained by the airline industry when the regulatory environment changed dramatically in 1978. The effects of this inflection point are still being felt, both by the industry and by passengers. It changed the way we fly and even how we conceive of flying. Deregulation of the airline industry beginning in 1978 proved a bounty to the American consumer. But the airlines seemed unaware of the deep implications for their very survival. The Airline Deregulation Act created a radically new regulatory environment that challenged the airlines in ways they'd not even contemplated. It removed government control over fares, over routes, and over market entry of new airlines in commercial aviation. This powerful strategic inflection point should have left the legacy airlines scrambling to develop new business models. But most airlines continued doing business as usual with the old model, routines, and repertoires. They seemed oblivious to the inflection point, to the necessity of modifying strategy in accord with the dictates of the new environment. Except for Southwest Airlines. Offering its first flights in 1971, this regional airline specialized in point-to-point travel instead of hub-and-spoke operations, refused baggage transfers from other airlines, and it offered unreserved seating. In short, the legacy carriers refused to recognize, or simply could not recognize, how to make money in the new changed regulatory environment, completely misreading the implications for the future of air travel in the midst of this strategic inflection point. A final example from business is the bittersweet tale of one of America's most beloved and iconic brands. This is the firm that brought us the phrase to share a Kodak moment. Kodak and Polaroid were two iconic camera and chemical film companies that dominated their industry in the United States until the end of the 1980s. The digital imaging revolution radically changed the industry, and new competitors emerged, manufacturing filmless digital cameras. The change in the industry was phenomenally fast, with demand for film plummeting. Both companies were challenged, and neither had the ability to respond correctly to the fact that the era of chemical film was ending rapidly. Neither could believe the market was changing as rapidly as it actually was. Kodak, especially, believed that it had an additional decade of film sales in developing countries before the digital revolution could possibly take over. Kodak flailed helplessly throughout the 1990s as the digital revolution engulfed it. Both companies bet wrong. Polaroid went bankrupt in 2001, and Kodak was left at the end of 2011 selling off more than 1,100 digital imaging invention patents to generate cash flow and seeking the shelter of bankruptcy at the beginning of 2012 while it reorganized. This is not necessarily the end for Kodak. It holds a reservoir of intellectual property potentially worth millions and has shown signs of trying to reinvent itself. After all, Polaroid eventually emerged from bankruptcy in a new incarnation in the late 2000s. Most recently, that company seemed to go in an entirely new direction. In early 2010, Polaroid partnered with the pop music diva Lady Gaga, and the company appointed her as the company's creative director. So there's hope for Kodak, even as the firm leaves folks scratching their heads asking, what happened to this once powerful company? And the great irony is that Kodak invented the first digital camera in 1975. Scholars for decades to come will ponder these strategic missteps of a company that owned the core of the digital revolution, but instead of leading it, was nearly destroyed by it. And that question is, if an inflection point has made the business model inadequate for the future, what fundamentally must change, and how do we change it? Let's take the case of Mr. Richard J. Harrington, who became CEO of Thomson Corporation in 1997 and saw the looming reality of major industry changes. He detected a major shift in the correlation of forces. Harrington had joined the company in 1982, and he became CEO in 1997. The firm dabbled in regional newspapers, professional publishing, and textbooks. In fact, the company seemed like a grab bag of publishing ventures. Although the business he took over was doing quite well, with almost $9 billion in yearly revenue, Harrington, he looked over the horizon, and what he saw worried him. He saw the inevitability of change wrought by emerging technology. Harrington clearly grasped how the digital revolution was changing the business landscape, how the firm's business model would generate less and less revenue in a fast-approaching future. He determined that Thomson would not be left behind by the looming inflection point. In fact, he believed his firm could and should be a leader. This was a bold move. You don't see this often in corporate America. It's quite rare that a company in a comfortable position actually engages with a time horizon longer than the next fiscal year. In fact, far too often you see the exact opposite. Too much of the ain't broke, don't fix it mentality, dawdling and excuse-making and timidity. Management guru Gary Hamel put it this way: every business is successful until it's not. What's disconcerting, though, is how often top management is surprised when not happens. Denial follows a familiar pattern. Disquieting developments are at first dismissed as, well, implausible or inconsequential. Then they're rationalized away as aberrant or irremediable. Then they're grudgingly mitigated through defensive action, and then, finally, though not always, honestly confronted. But Harrington was willing to take the short-term hit in earnings and the costs of tooling up for the future demands of a radically new publishing model. Thomson would focus on electronic publishing in the professional field. They would build an integrated information enterprise and enter a market with established competitors such as McGraw-Hill and Reed Elsevier. It would take time. It would take patience. Businesses would be sold, new businesses bought, new competencies acquired. It would take the guts to tolerate depressed earnings while the company restructured. Thomson spent $7 billion over the next several years to buy more than 200 businesses, and it shed more than 130 of its regional newspapers. In a business culture oriented toward short-term earnings, this was indeed a bold move. But within just 5 years, Thomson had transformed itself and was threatening Elsevier's #1 position in the professional publishing field. Richard Harrington had become Thomson's CEO at a moment when the company wasn't in trouble. It was quite comfortable, in fact. But unlike Kodak, Harrington looked over the horizon and he saw an unfavorable correlation of forces, forces that would transform the industry, create a strategic inflection point, and engulf Thomson. But under Harrington, Thomson confronted reality, saw the coming inflection point, and responded superbly. In sports, the strategic inflection point emerges periodically, most often in the form of rule changes that dictate changes in strategy. Sometimes the inflection point we can identify retrospectively was a result of a series of smaller changes. A major and quite gradual example comes from chess. Until the 15th century, the queen in chess was a relatively weak piece. Through gradual changes in the game's rules and by contemporary convention, the queen emerged in 16th century European chess as the most powerful piece on the board. From weakest piece to strongest piece by virtue of a rule change fits our definition of a strategic inflection point. And drastically different status of the queen required radical transformation of strategy, tactics of the game. Major rule changes can cause major changes in how a game is played. Now, these effects cascade into strategy. In one of America's most popular sports, professional football, seemingly minor changes in the rules have resulted in wholesale transformation of the game. In 1978, for example, a simple rule change that only affected a handful of players in a tiny portion of the field radically altered the strategies pursued. The 5-yard bump rule changed how a defensive back could interact with a wide receiver on the snap of the ball. Now, after the change, a defender was only allowed to bump a receiver within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage on the snap. Beyond that, and a flag would be thrown for continued aggressive interference with the receiver. This seems a simple enough rule change, but its effect was astounding. It gave receivers more leeway to display athleticism, and we saw the institution of wide-open pro-style pass-heavy offenses that led to large numbers of 300-yard passing games. It also led to subtle changes in the physical makeup of players in the cornerback position. This is the swift defensive back who plays pass protection on either side of the field. Until the 5-yard bump rule, cornerbacks were big and strong to stop the run, and they were counted on to bump the receiver and rough him up on pass plays. After the rule change, All-Pro cornerback Eric Allen says that the position changed radically, and the coaches began putting small and quick types into the position. Allen said that guys who made their living on the bump and run can't do that anymore, and it's obvious now that receivers can do just about anything they want to. We can see that the changed regulatory environment led to radical changes in the game's strategy, and even the types of players recruited to play the position affected by the new rules. One other rule change in 1994 was so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by the average fan, and yet had a tremendous impact on the game. 8 inches. The rule change affected just 8 inches on the field, yet it's had a strategic impact on the game that continues today. The rule change affected the position of offensive linemen. Previously, all linemen had to line up even with the center's jersey. The rule change allowed them to line up 8 inches farther back, even with the belt buckle of the center. Now, this additional 8 inches gives linemen a split second more to pick up their blocks on hard-charging defensive linemen. It allows them to form the pass protection pocket sooner, and for the first time, they can actually hear the signals in a noisy stadium. This affords greater protection for the quarterback, who in turn has more time to pass the ball. The receivers have a moment more to elude coverage and break free of the coverage. It makes for better communication between quarterback and the line, and it leads to fewer penalties. It puts more pressure on the defense, and it leads to changes in both offensive and defensive strategy. In short, this rule change redounds to the benefit of the entire offensive unit, and the good effects cascade and effervesce throughout the game. The strategic inflection point in this case exerted a dynamic change on the game. It meant dramatic changes in the way the game is played. It demands new skill sets and skills in different combinations than were required prior to the change. Perhaps most important, it requires the acumen to recognize the radical impact of small regulatory changes on strategy, on the whole character of the game. Now, politics would seem an area fertile with strategic inflection points. The weight of regulation on political competition is quite heavy, and yet they're difficult to exploit, partly because phalanxes of political operatives play the game 24/7, regardless of our place in the election cycle. One minor inflection point was the limitation of the president's term from unlimited successive terms to 2 consecutive terms. A vengeful Republican Congress enacted this legislation in the wake of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 consecutive election victories. Roosevelt's tenure had been an aberration, and the Congress intended to keep it so. And in one sense, the change merely codified what had been a tradition among American presidents since the time of Washington. But the change also forced presidents in their second term into lame duck status, since there was no longer any chance they might run for office again. Consider also the process by which we nominate candidates from major parties. Consider how the power has shifted from the party conventions to the primaries, where delegates to the convention are won, and then the jockeying of pride of position among states to schedule their primary ahead of others, so as to garner more influence. Interacting with this is the individual candidate campaign, which must decide where to compete and how. It must raise scarce campaign dollars and decide how to spend them in a strategic marketing mix. New technologies can present politicians with inflection points as well. In U.S. presidential politics, think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's use of radio, Kennedy and Reagan on TV, and perhaps the internet in Obama's campaign for the presidency in 2008. The lesson here is this: you may not see yourself as being in a technology sector, but that doesn't mean that you won't experience an inflection point based on new technology. In military conflict, technology can yield a temporary competitive advantage to the side that most quickly recognizes and adapts most to the changes wrought. A famous example is Western Christendom's launch in the year of the first of 9 Crusades over the period 1095 to 1291. Knights and peasants repeatedly marched east to liberate the Holy Land from the domination of Islam. It is supremely relevant to our discussion today about strategic inflection points, in that a clash of cultures has historically entailed a dramatic change to which the people and organizations involved must adapt or perish. The Crusades represent the dramatic collision of 2 great cultures, broadly conceived, Western and Eastern. In the best of circumstances, cultures have difficulty meshing at first, as suspicion is the first response. And in this circumstance, these 2 great cultures touched in the most heated of circumstances: holy war. The Arabs and Turks of the Middle East first faced such an inflection point in 1095. This first crusade was the most successful, as Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. This owes at least in part to the surprise in military tactics and strategy utilized by the Frankish knights against the Saracens. But the surprise was mutual, as the technologies of 2 different types came into conflict for the very first time on a grand scale. It was superior European technology that presented the Arab armies with a strategic inflection point. Suddenly, the Muslim armies faced an enemy whose armor could resist their curved short swords and their light arrows, whose crossbows conferred fire superiority, whose horses were much larger and more powerful, and whose combat tactics were aided by the use of saddles and stirrups, whose siege machines could conquer native forts, whose own castles were almost impregnable to the Muslim attack, and whose crossbow gave the Europeans undoubted fire superiority. The crossbow, in fact, was an extreme technological game changer. While the longbow took years to master and great strength to use, a man could become proficient at the crossbow in mere hours. And the crossbow's heavy bolt, it could pierce plate armor. And the Muslims faced for the first time the holy orders of the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights. Historian Stephen Christ calls these warriors the most effective fighting forces in the Holy Land. These forces, they were armed with lances, and the charge of these immense knights in the open field was virtually unstoppable. Another example finds the Europeans getting the short end, this time in the 13th century. When we think of European history, we usually don't think of Genghis Khan and his descendants, Kublai Khan and the Batu Khan. These were the Mongols that conquered much of the known world in the 13th century. Batu Khan's Mongol horde conquered several Hungarian armies in southern Europe in 1241, and he was on the verge of sweeping into Austria when it challenged an army under King Bela of Hungary. The Mongols under General Subutai and Batu Khan annihilated the Hungarians, a force that included Hungarian heavy cavalry, Knights Templar, nomadic light cavalry mercenaries, and Serbian valiants. The Europeans never stopped the Mongol horde. And only the death of the great Khan Ogadai in December of 1241 broke the tempo of the Mongol invasion of Europe. The death of the Khan required the princes of the blood to lead the horde back to Mongolia for the selection process of a new Khan. The Europeans slammed into their own strategic inflection point, the same kind of inflection point that gave them victory over the Saracens of the Holy Land 150 years earlier. This time, the Europeans faced a raft of new military techniques that led to their defeat. The Mongols succeeded against the European-style knight and its military formations because of a new combination of tactics and combat style. They employed speed and unique supply techniques that gave them far greater mobility and maneuverability to project power. They utilized scouts and intelligence analysis far more than their counterparts, and they attempted to maneuver the enemy onto battlefields of Mongol choosing. They sent spies for almost 10 years into Europe, and they mapped the old Roman roads, and they determined the level of ability of each principality to resist invasion, as well as who might ally with whom. The European concept of courage placed great emphasis on personal valor, and so the leaders were often exposed to danger and killed during a melee. By contrast, the Mongols protected their leaders, who posted themselves on high ground from where they could observe the battle and make tactical decisions as the events unfolded. Now, the cumulative effect of all of these novel tactics and superior techniques was to present Europe with an inflection point. One scholar has discovered in Chinese accounts of the Battle of Mohi in 1241 that it was the Mongols who introduced the use of gunpowder in combat into Europe. In the end, it was fortune and not Europe's adaptation that stopped the horde from attacking Italy and Germany and from conquering perhaps all of Europe, just as it eventually conquered China in what is now Russia. Business, sports, politics, and war. The strategic inflection point is a whimsical, surprising, deadly player in all of these realms. In our own lives, we have to be alert to the emergence of an inflection point. Andy Grove says that one of the biggest problems with inflection points is telling them apart from garden variety changes, especially as we've seen when our disposition is to resist change. We want to do business as usual. We want to believe changes are minor. We react to changes, but we don't want to tear the business into pieces and reassemble them every time someone says boo. But we also don't want to be oblivious to the changes around us that may portend ill for us if we don't read them correctly and respond to the indicators. Signals given us by a new boss, a changed spouse, a company whose policies change for seemingly no reason, changes in the rules of our lives we've set, both explicit and implicit. So how do you recognize a strategic inflection point as distinguished from a historical hiccup? Andy Grove, who coined the term, had quite a bit of experience in dealing with inflection points in the high-tech industry. His insights are valid across the spectrum of organizations and individuals dealing with sudden and sometimes radical change. Andy gives us some warning signs. If the company or firm or entity you're dealing with gives signs of having shifted, it means you may be experiencing an inflection point. If suddenly your attention is drawn away from your lifelong competitor or a single company that has had you captive, and now you're worried about someone or something new, there may be an inflection point. Grove has a final acid test. He asks himself a rhetorical question he calls the silver bullet test. What if I had only one bullet? Where would you aim? You had been aiming somewhere for most of your life, but suddenly you changed the direction of your pistol. That's a key signal that you may be dealing with something more than a minor change in the competitive landscape.